everyone. This is Des, and you are listening to the Wellness Project powered by Spotlight Coalition. On today's episode, I am speaking with Mike Martin. I am speaking with him about his mental health struggles and how the outdoors have helped to improve his mental health. I'm so excited to speak with Mike because I am always telling people to get outside more. Nature will do you wonders. Nature is so grounding, so healing, and I think it makes a really big impact on our mental health. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Mike's story and hear his experience with how the outdoors improved his mental health. All right, so let's speak with Mike. All right, everyone, I am here with Mike Martin. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to speak with you. So, can you give us a little introduction to who you are, what you've experienced with your mental health, and how you got to where you are today?
So I'm Mike Martin. I'm the guide, voice, host, and creative genius behind Project Mindfully Outdoors, which chronicles my story with dealing with anxiety, depression, the ups and downs that that's led to, and the new reality of living as a divorced father for the past couple of years. So
Okay, so how far back can you remember struggling with anxiety and depression?
I think that started as a kid. It was kind of like one of those things you just fall into and you really don't realize it. And for a long time, back for the bulk of my life, I let that just kind of define me. And I accepted whatever somebody told me about myself because, it validated that horrible spot within me. And it was more comfortable than trying to deal with it. I've always hid behind, whatever masks that I could find. And finally, as I mentioned, being a divorced father, I had my second divorce and I learned how to finally stop hiding from it. And I came out and faced it. And that's kind of brought me to learning how to manage it through the different Stoic philosophies and things like that, as well as the outdoors.
Growing up as a kid, were you aware that you were struggling with anxiety or depression, or did you know that you felt different? Did you compare your feelings to other people? Like, what made you realize that what you were feeling was off or different in a way?
I think my first real ability to kind of acknowledge that something was different was a lot of the music that I was listening to as a teenager was like that real doom and gloom type stuff and kind of the grungy rock and things like that. And it really resonated with me. Like a lot of the messages are kind of like how bleak things were and whatnot. And I'm like, that really fits me more than being happy and joyful. So it wasn't until my 20s though that I really began to, I guess, become aware of it because I always just, without thinking about it, felt it and coped with it. But I used to be a cutter and I had kind of that really bad binge where it was either suicide or cut until the feelings left. And they didn't leave, but I knew that I didn't want to walk through that door. So I ended up in the hospital and spending a couple weeks in the psych ward kind of really woke me up to realize that I had a lot going on.
Thank you for sharing that because I feel like a lot of men in particular, they're not very open about their self-harm and the anxiety and depression. So I'm really thankful that you're being so open about it. Can you share at what age you started self-harming?
I think that probably started around like somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. It was kind of more like the minor, just, hitting yourself and things like that, or finding ways to get hurt. And then ultimately that led into, hey, I can physically do this myself when I need it. And it was like a visualizing process of being able to see those negative feelings leave my body, as opposed to where like somebody will cry out their emotions. I would actually have to physically bleed them out.
Right. And I'm really glad that you bring this up because I think a lot of people don't realize for boys and men in particular, self-harm looks a little bit different than it does for girls or women. So boys for self-harm are more likely they do cut and burn and things like that, but they are more likely to hit themselves in the head, bang their head against the wall, punch things. So that is a form of self-harm that I think maybe a lot of adults aren't aware of when a kid is slamming their head against the wall. They don't realize that is self harm. So I'm really glad that you bring up that point. I think it's really important for people to know.
It is. It's kind of one of those like, little Jimmy's having a temper tantrum, so we just ignore it type things. But it really is kind of the gateway into some of the more extreme versions of it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, I think that's something else that people don't really realize about self harm is that the issue with self harm is that it works, right? It does make you feel better. It does take away that inner pain and kind of externalizes it in a way. And like you said, releases it. So that's the really difficult part about self-harming is that it's effective in decreasing that inner pain. So that's why a lot of people have a hard time stopping that behavior.
Yeah, it took me many years to consistently get to a point where I was able to say that I was completely self-harm free. So even though I took the opportunity, I acknowledged it and said I want to change this behavior, it really took a lot of work and a lot of time and effort before I finally got it right.
Right. And it does. And when I've worked with clients that self harm, it's almost similar to a relapse, right? Like you're on the wagon or sober for however long, and then you fall off the wagon. Like clients would come in and, they'd keep track of their self harm. And some of them had like a diary to keep track of it. And they'd say, oh, I haven't self harmed in a week or 2 months. And they'd come in and say, oh, I self harmed again. Like I have to start over. And so that's something also about when you're trying to stop self harming that something that happens is that you do almost in a way relapse.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of you got to give yourself a little bit of grace and understanding along the early part of that adventure of working towards getting past it because you are going to stumble because it is such an easy thing to fall back into habit wise that as you go along the path, like what worked for me was to start hiding what I would call my tools. Like I would freeze them in water. So they'd sit in the ice block and be just kind of comfortable knowing that they were there, but it would take some time for that ice to melt in order for me to get a hold of them.
Right. And that's something that I always recommend to families and parents as well for a client. Cause I work with kids and teens for a client that is self harming, but they want to stop and they don't want those means or access to let the parents know to take away all the knives, lock up the scissors, even the pencil sharpeners, the eyeliner sharpener, things like that to lock it away, to take away access to that. But if you're really feeling that urge and that feeling, I've even had clients, break off wood off of their bed frame and things like that. So to try to get something sharp. So it is tough removing mirrors. So it is difficult. So I'm glad that you're sharing this ways that have helped you.
It's kind of funny actually as we go along and we're kind of discussing this, it's kind of making me re-travel that path. And I think to add to that would be not just the physical recovery aspect of it, because even when you step past the physical part of it, you still have that mental desire and that can manifest in different ways. Because I think that's probably what actually led me down a lot of the path that we're about to get into. Is I just took it and I shifted it into something else to feed that same desire.
Okay, yeah, I definitely want to get into that. So let's go back a little bit before we get into that. So you said, growing up, you had this anxiety, you had this depression, you had these self harm behaviors, but you talked about all these masks that you kind of hid behind. So did your family, friends, teachers, anybody know that you were struggling?
I would say probably not enough to be concerned about it because there may have been warning signs. Being a parent myself now, I look for stuff like that, so I'm aware. But maybe back then when the conversation wasn't so open, a lot of that just gets swept under the rug, like, hey, those are just growing pains.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a good point that parents sometimes don't know exactly what to look for because I think it's hard to tell sometimes, teenagers are moody, they do kind of isolate and separate themselves from their parents, they do hide away in their room. So, can you share for parents what kind of things that you believe that they should look for, what you look for in your child or children?
It's a lot of that up and down kind of in the attitude. But then again, I look a lot for the self-talk because we all do it, we'll all just kind of speak out, like something, for example, I'm stupid, when we're having a bad moment or we do something wrong. While it's not always bad, I mean, yeah, we've all got to improve our self-talk, but when it's consistent, it's something in, a child to look into and kind of explore why they're saying those kind of things. I think the dialogue that my kids use with themselves is something that's very important, and it kind of does give a lot of insight into things. And the same goes with their behavior. If they're constantly trying to hide things or steer you off in a different direction, there could be something going on that is worth taking the time to sit down and have a roundabout conversation. Just kind of paint a picture and let them go with it where they go, and you can pick up the little bit of variables in between because you know your child better than anybody else.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Would you mind sharing a little bit? So, you grew up kind of hitting yourself, things like that, but it did escalate to cutting behaviors. At what point do you remember the first time that you actually cut yourself?
That was probably somewhere between like 11 or 12. It came out of the byproduct of an argument, a real emotional argument that I couldn't process where I was at. I would probably guess, trying to jump back into that headspace, the step that I was at as far as, smacking my head on things and whatnot wasn't doing the job. And that was just accessible in the next logical step in trying to remove it.
Okay. And had you known about cutting? Had any of your friends cut or had you seen that on TV or anything?
I don't think in those days that it was like a open enough subject. It was more taboo, so it really wasn't like on TV or accessible. And to be honest with you, I'm not even sure that any of my friends had ever really, tried the subject or talked about it.
Okay. So, this is something that you kind of just had that urge to do and it made you feel better.
Exactly. It was more like I had the urge and somehow I connected the dots with something and was like, hey, that works for the time being.
Did you know that it wasn't something that was appropriate? Like, did you feel like you had to hide it and keep it from your family?
I felt I'd probably be questioned for it. So yeah, it definitely needed to be hidden.
At any point, did your family or any teachers, friends realize that you were self harming?
No, I feel like I was probably a little too good at hiding it or at least making people uncomfortable enough with the idea to discuss it or think that, I was really doing something like that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Understandable. And so you mentioned that this kind of escalated in your 20s. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It was pretty much becoming like an everyday thing that was my go-to for anything and everything. By that point, it's probably easiest to say that I was really lost within the anxiety, the depression, and just this overall feeling like I'm prolonging the day until I inevitably ain't here anymore. For many years along there, it was that mentality, like, I'm just kind of riding this until I hit the grave, and whatever happens along the way happens.
You did have a suicide attempt, is that correct?
Yes,
And what age were you at that time?
I was easily in my late 20s. In fact, that correlated with me ending up realizing that it was time to give up the self harm because it wasn't doing what I needed it to do anymore.
self-harm, right, it is a coping skill. It's an unhealthy coping
Right.
skill, but it is a coping skill. So it seems like it kind of escalated over time, and it wasn't functioning anymore. It wasn't serving its purpose. So as for triggers, what you mentioned, the argument, what were some other triggers in your life that to lead you to that behavior?
I think it was just, a lot of generalized feeling emotions because I was always the type that, everything was gloomy and depressive, so I didn't want to feel it. And when I had to feel something, I couldn't process it. So, like I mentioned earlier, referred to about, the crying aspect that, most people, when they get emotionally overwhelmed, cry. I couldn't do that. So it was a matter of, cutting it out of me to see it go, or with the suicidal ideas and stuff like that. Anything that I couldn't accept being in my thought process, I had to physically remove it.
So there was a shift. So now you're all about being mindfully outdoors and being in nature and having healthy coping skills. So when did that shift happen? Did it happen after your suicide attempt? Like what did that journey look like to incorporate more healthy coping skills and kind of decrease that self-harm behavior?
Well, it literally, because there was a more recent suicide attempt about 3 years ago, somewhere in that area, and it literally started the day after that attempt. What had happened was I had taken a bunch of pills and was living in between my truck and an old deer blind, and I was just so lost and everything. I ended up waking up the next morning and just going about the day like nothing had happened, not even thinking about it. A podcast that I listened to at the time called The Hunting Collective, there was a author named Ryan Holiday who was talking about his new book at the time, and mentioned some really powerful Stoic quotes that like literally felt like I was being punched in the stomach. Like, hey, you better shut up and listen to these things. That became the shifting point. From there, I got into online therapy and introduced to all these ideas like mindfulness that at the time when we had the talk, it was, man, that's really crazy. That's really silly. And then to sit back and think about it, and I'm like, I do those things when I'm in the outdoors. When I'm out hunting and fishing, I sit and I meditate. I sit and I just connect with everything. The two started tying together for me. It was like the outdoors became a safe place to contemplate and figure out all these different things and mix it with the philosophy. And it's been a huge mindset shift that even though there's the talk therapy involved, it's been something that came from within. And that was all following my second divorce.
Wow, that's amazing. I love hearing your story. Can you explain what the outdoors does for you, for your mindset, and how it impacts your mental health?
It provides like a safe avenue to, literally explore new ideas or to just sit and be alone with your thoughts. Like, for example, I had said something about how I thought meditation was so silly when it was first formally introduced to me. When you're sitting in a deer blind and you're, in my case, pulling up my crossbow, getting ready for a shot, the focus 110% is on nothing but your breathing and slowing down your thought process, which is meditation. And from there, I learned how to slowly begin to feel safe and comfortable doing that without my bow and pulling that into my everyday in the morning and evening practices. And I started to feel a bit of a mind shift. And then I thought about like my anxiety. In fact, the first article that I wrote came about because I was on the boat teaching a friend of mine how to fish. And in doing so, I was like, you visualize that you're the bait that you just threw down there. You're this little fish that's trying to have the biggest panic attack in the world to get the larger fish to come out and attack you. And then you get to have your battle and you get to pull them in. Well, for me, with my social anxiety, when I go to the store, I feel like I'm that little fish bouncing around on the bottom, except I'm trying to run away from all the big predators, which is what that natural fish would be doing. I started tying in the quotes that I had heard from like the Stoic philosophy stuff about one of the big ones for me was about how adversity was an opportunity to highlight who you truly were. And the reason that was so important to me was because the last words said to my face at the time of my second divorce was I had nothing to offer anyone, including my family. So I wanted to change that. And that was kind of the momentum to make me just get stubborn enough to start doing these things.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's really amazing. So while those words could have been so hurtful, they were kind of, in a way, they helped you be determined and inspired you to make changes in your life.
Oh, yes, at the time they were horrible. And then I started to shift the mindset, and then it became motivation. And that's sparked a massive change in my life for the better.
Oh, wow. And that must have been pretty mind blowing, that experience of feeling like meditation was kind of silly and then realizing that in a way you were meditating every time you went fishing or hunting. So that must have been pretty interesting for you to realize that.
It was interesting to realize it. And I apparently at times I'm a very slow learner. So all of a sudden now I'm finding myself in a space where all that stuff is like catching up with me and I'm starting to see it. So now it's kind of like that whole shock and awe thing. Like I laughed about this then, but look at what it did to me.
And how long have you been fishing and hunting?
I started doing that when I was a child with my grandfather. That's where I had started to learn all that stuff. And he had a massive stroke in my early teens. I think it was about then. Yeah, I was probably about 10, somewhere between 10 and 12. And that took me out of the hunting and fishing until, ironically, when about the time that he passed away, I started getting back into it. And that's another aspect of it that I find very comforting is it feels like I'm regenerating and reconnecting with that old connection.
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm really sorry for your loss. And that must have been really hard around that age that you were already experiencing all that anxiety and depression. Then to have, a major stroke happen within the family, that must have been really hard for you.
Yeah, it was difficult. It was a long process. He survived many years after that. So that was like the fortunate part of it. The other aspect of it was, dealing with the feelings of, grief and things like that. And then, growing up, being your identity is partly taking care of an elderly family member that really needs you. So you don't really get to explore who you are at that point in time when most people are.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And as for the connection that you made about nature and being outdoors and its impact on you and your mental health, how often now do you try to get outside, knowing how important that is for you?
I'm out there now every free day that I get. So I'm out there at least 2 to 3 days a week. I take my kids out there with me when I have them, and it's a very important aspect of our lives. And I'm teaching them all those same virtues as well.
Yeah. And can you share everybody where you are right now?
I am sitting inside of my turkey blind right now.
Yeah. Yep, I got to see. You guys can't see it because this is audio only, but I did get to see it. Really, really cool. So that's great that you make that connection with your kids as well, because I think just nowadays being 2022, a lot of people, work in an office or work from home and then they commute for like 2 hours a day. So, and we're in this sedentary lifestyle. So I think especially now it's so hard to have that connection with the outdoors. And we're just inside so much. And I think that does really impact our mental health. So I'm really glad that you're sharing that with your kids.
Yeah, that's kind of what I do with Project Mindfully Outdoors is I like to bridge that gap and kind of teach people that this stuff is number one, safe. Number two, it's okay and it's fun to get out there and even just to get them to start going out for a walk around the block, going to the park, basic things to get you going. Because there's a lot of skills as I've learned along this way that you utilize in the outdoors that apply to everyday life. And that's really where I found my safety net is like, say, I'm outside hunting like I am right now, and I've got to make a snap decision. I've got that security in what I do so I can trust myself to make that snap decision. When I'm in my day to day life and I've got to make the same snap decision, it's still a little hard for me at this point in time, but I can find that confidence because I know if I can do it outside, I can do it, when it counts in the real world too.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and I definitely want to get into other kind of different coping skills that you have, even for those days that you're not able to get outside or just additional coping skills that are helpful for you in your life.
Well, I'm a very, very heavy journaler. I love to just sit and write my thoughts out since I'm pretty introverted and spend a lot of time, away, and I've got to, that's kind of how I collect myself. So I've got probably 4 or 5 journals that I keep for many different reasons in many different ways. Not to mention, I invest a lot of quality creative time into my podcast, and I also read a lot. So I read a lot of like nonfiction, thought provoking type stuff. Those are the things that I find to help. And then when I'm in the mood to be more active, but I can't get out in the woods, if at all possible, I'll grab my kids and we'll, go run around the yard or find some kind of scavenger hunt, something crazy and fun to do for a little while. To me, it's about staying busy and creative because an idle mind and idle hands are not always the most healthy thing to have. And if you can stay busy in a way that's productive and that benefits you, then I think you're on the right track.
Oh, great. Yes, I love all of those ideas and suggestions. Do you have any books in particular that you would be able to share that have really helped you that you may want to recommend to our listeners?
Oh, I could go on forever with a crazy reading list, but I'm gonna say, based on the fact that these 2 books not only saved my life, but flipped my entire mindset around. Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way, which then led me into Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which was very life changing, and he's become one of my biggest heroes. And then the other philosopher that I love to read is Seneca, and he has a collection of works out called The Letters from a Stoic to Lucilia, who he was kind of mentoring in later on in his life. And let's see, from there, I would have to say American Buffalo by Stephen Rennell. Ranella was one that really kind of got me, and I've read that one many times. And speaking of books that I read many times over, there's a book about turkey hunting that's called The Turkey by Sergeant Ryan Kelly, and I read that every spring leading up to spring turkey.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much for sharing all of those. Everyone, I'm going to link all of those books in the show notes. So don't worry, you'll be able to go in the show notes and check those out. Thank you for sharing those. And so you are a bit of a writer yourself. Can you tell everyone about your book that you have coming out?
I am in the second stage of the writing process, which is rewriting and editing what is going to be called No One is Beyond Redemption. And the book follows the process that I took to reconnect with my estranged daughter after 8.5 to 9 years of time in between seeing her and for the last time, and then ultimately seeing her at a park for the first time. And the reason that I'm writing this book is even though for a long time I carried a lot of shame about the fact that I was an absentee father to her. We had one of our first alone adventures. I picked her up after work, took her to dinner. We ran around town, chased some marching bands of the parade and everything that night. And after I dropped her off, I thought about just how much I had robbed her and robbed myself of experiences like that. I hope that through the book, I can inspire just one person just one parent that doesn't have contact with their kid to reach out and to mend that relationship.
Oh, wow. That sounds really, really powerful. Is there any way that you've incorporated your daughter's perspective in the book or her story, or is this strictly like your perspective, or do you know about her perspective?
I'm learning about her perspective now. And when I started writing the book, I did it with a combination of, my story and different stories throughout history that I applied into the process of not only going through, the aspects to get in touch with her, but also the work that it takes to create a safe and warm environment for a child to come into a situation like that.
Oh, right. Wow. Well, I look forward to reading that. So please let me know when you have that published, and I will put that in the show notes as well, no matter the time frame. I know you're still in editing mode, but how old is your daughter now?
My daughter will be 12 here in about a month.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, that's a really great age too.
Yes, it's been quite the adventure, and through it, I've learned not only a lot about her, but also a lot about myself because, like I said, I carried a lot of shame about it. But then again, I also carried this feeling inside that everything that I try to do, I fail at. One thing that's been a common theme within my developing a relationship with her is those things get challenged because here I am a year later and she's fought and she's kicked and she's screamed every step of the way, which I don't blame her for, but I'm succeeding. Now she's getting to a point where she can't kick and scream and deny things that, she's thinking and experiencing. And it's finally our relationship has grown past that, awkward, yeah, you're here, but where you been? And I'm not going to ask you kind of stage. So now we're starting to get into I'm accepting and I'm growing into it and I'm glad that you're there type stage. And, I'll be honest with you. Throughout the process, I wish this kid came with text message alerts. Because one thing that you'll find along the process that really makes this difficult is they're not going to tell you when they hit different stages along the ride. They just do them. I know personally, I found myself putting my foot in my mouth many a times already. And I compare the analogy and the reason for it is it's kind of like watching a baby stand up and get ready to take their first steps. You instantly want to grab them to protect them and keep them safe from hurting themselves when they smack their face on the table. And that's because you don't know exactly how ready they are physically to make that leap and start, we're running off. And that's kind of where I'm at now as far as on my end. It's like I've seen you kick and scream and fight every step of this. And now all of a sudden, without that text message alert, you're pumping everything you got into it. And I'm afraid that you might be overwhelming yourself. So I'm kind of my foot's going in my mouth trying to catch you before you hit the floor or smack your face on the table.
I'm sure just the fact that you two are spending time together, that I'm sure she really appreciates that relationship with you now and you reaching out and putting in that effort to build a relationship with her.
Absolutely. And I think to be completely honest with you, this is probably one of the most petrifying things that I've ever tried to do. Leading up to meeting her, I was obviously racked with anxiety and fear and everything else. And there was one line that my therapist said to me that it hit me so hard it took all that away. And that was the fact that what I was doing was going to impact her life and change her narrative forever, no matter what
Mhm.
the outcome was. That right there, even if you, for whatever reason, lose north on your compass and you take yourself away from a child, whatever the circumstances are, to be able to give yourself back authentically and with the right intention is the greatest gift that you can ever give them back.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's important for a lot of parents to hear because I work with kids and teens, and a lot of them are out of touch with their biological parent. And I think it does absolutely, you're right, affect them for the rest of their lives. And it does make a difference to them when their parent does reach out. And sometimes they choose not to build a relationship with that parent, or it's not the right time, they're not ready, whatever the case may be. But I think it's important that a parent does, like you said, if they lose their compass, they lose their way, to reach out and try to rebuild that relationship, because that in itself will open up the doors and impacts the child. And they have the choice of whether they want to take that opportunity or not, or maybe they're not ready and want to later, but they know that door is open for when they're ready.
Right. And, as I shared, it's the most petrifying thing that you can do is to face something like that. And I kind of equate it to the story that I shared in the book about Davy Crockett and the Alamo. Is you get behind this message so strongly that when you walk into it, it's going to change you, no matter what that change looks like on the other side. It doesn't matter. You fight and you scratch and you claw as hard as it takes to get that message to where it goes. The way that I share it in the book was the fact that, Davy Crockett believed so strongly in freedom that when they overran him in the Alamo and the dust settled, he had fought so hard that when they found him, he was underneath a pile of his would-be assailants, and he had only finally stopped when he could no longer remove his knife. That to me is a whole sense of bravery that inspired me to show up at the park, walk over the hill, and say face to face, hey, I messed up really bad, but I'm here and I want to try to do the right thing by you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that takes so much courage on so many levels, not only to build a relationship with somebody that you've hurt, but to take that accountability and face that. I mean, that's terrifying. That takes so much courage to work through. So I really commend you for that. That's really, really difficult.
There's the aspect of it where when you're sitting there having that kind of conversation and you get to that point where you not only apologized, but then you tell them that, the reality of things is none of this is your fault. The relief and the change in their eyes that you see when they look at you and you say that is something that makes a world of difference to them, and they can't hide that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you brought that up because working with kids, for some reason, kids always blame themselves if there's an absent parent or absent guardian, or there's addiction or drinking, whatever the case may be, mental illness, or whatever it is. The child always blames themselves, and they feel like it's their fault that their parent that they're just so unlovable, so unlikable. It's their fault that their parent, their guardian doesn't want a relationship with them. So I think that's so important to let the child know this isn't on you. You didn't do anything, and I'm taking responsibility and accountability, and I want to make changes. I think that makes a huge difference for a child to hear that.
It does. It's one of the most important things that they need to hear. And the part that made it so easy for me to be absent outside of my depression and things like that was the fact that I grew up without a father. So I grew up in that broken cycle. I never got those kind of words. In fact, I never really had the opportunity to form that relationship. So yeah, growing up, I blamed myself and I had all those kind of issues. And to be able to have done the work to get the opportunity to be face to face with her, that was something that I was going to take away from her right then and there. And it really had a lasting effect.
Oh, I'm so glad. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your story, your journey. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice for our listeners today?
I'm so full of them. I mean, actually, before I jumped on this call, I was editing some writings for the upcoming episodes and whatnot. And I think I could probably tie into that with tying it back to the outdoors. This concept of when you start to pack your pack to go on a hike, it's only so big, so you can only fit so many things into it. The more you put in there, the more that it weighs you down. And that applies to our daily life too, because even though it's not physical, we carry a backpack that we constantly store stones within. Each stone that gets added to it, whether it's pain, trauma, whatever, resentment, you put any label on those. The more that those fill up that backpack, they start to push your identity out. When you're packing up to go out in the woods, you always look at what's in that backpack before you actually go. You make sure you've got the essential stuff. So if you take a minute to look at what's accumulating in that mental backpack, you can really weigh through there, figure out what needs to go and what needs to stay. What needs to stay is those things that help you survive through the day. What needs to go are those stones that take away your sense of who you are. And even though that process looks different for each and every one of us, if you take a piece of paper and you make a list of what those stones are, and then you tear that piece of paper up and you throw it away when you're done, you're off to a good start. You just visualized seeing all of those stones be removed.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Mike, can you tell everyone about your podcast and where they could find you?
So my podcast is called Project Mindfully Outdoors. And just about a month and a half ago, I jumped from 3 episodes a week up to 7 episodes. So every single day, there's a brand new episode where we explore having that philosophical sense of self within the outdoors, which I call self stewardship. And I tie very heavily into the idea of conservation and land stewardship because there's a lot that can be learned and applied to the daily life just out of the North American wildlife model in itself, not to mention, like I said earlier, all the skills that can be picked up by being outdoors. So we really heavily focus on that. You can find us at 7 days a week on Apple, Spotify, Google, anywhere that you listen to a podcast. And there's also a website, which is projectmindfullyoutdoors.wordpress.com. And there's daily articles and information and, just tidbits to think about posted daily there as well. And outside of that, we're on Facebook and Instagram at Project Mindfully Outdoors. So you can reach through the email if you want to reach out and talk. I'd love that idea too. I'm always there to help and support anybody at Project Mindfully Outdoors or at gmail.com.
Oh, great. And I will link all of those in the show notes. Everyone, go check out Mike. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your story today. I really appreciate it. I loved hearing it. I think it's going to help a lot of people.
Absolutely. You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. One thing that I've really enjoyed about this conversation is you brought a lot of things out of me that I don't get to really talk about or express on other podcasts. So this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate the time.
Oh, great. I'm so glad to hear that. I think it was a really great conversation and a very important one. So keep speaking about your story because I know it will help other people. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing your story. Everyone, go check out Mike in the show notes, and I hope that you can spend some time outside today. I'll see you next week with another amazing guest.